Live streaming is on.
Hello, world. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's February 19, 2021. We're grateful to Clinton Ignatoff for facilitating today. Thank you, Clinton. And it is an honor and a pleasure to be here with B.W. Powe. Is that the correct way to pronounce your name?
Yes.
Thank you so much, B.W. The first question. Yeah, well, the first question is, what's the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being is to understand suffering, reflection, meditation, and affliction, and to understand that we are deeply, deeply immersed in the ecology of a new environment in which the Big Bang, or striding and the blast, as Shakespeare would call it, that we are in the womb break, as it were, of a new form of sensibility and consciousness. And that explosion, implosion simultaneously, that breakdown, breakthrough simultaneously, is very much the condition in which we find ourselves. And so to speak out to one another about the suffering that this is bringing, the afflictions that these are bringing, that the power, anxiety, and the cosmopolitanism that this is bringing, and the fact that we are inside something so vast, so comprehensive, and so long-lasting that we have difficulty defining it and unforming because it's so unformed. But in so many ways, what we need to speak to each other about is what it is to be human in the middle of this vast transformation in which psyche, consciousness, neurology, and sensibility and biology are all being altered beyond our capacity, perhaps, to keep up with them.
Wow, that was well spoken. In BW, what's your favorite form of information? How information comes to you?
Well, here I set up what Marshall McLuhan called counter environments, and I call it resistance rebellion, which is that I write by hand. You see, I write by hand. I make my notes, and I sometimes in torn pages like this. My sapphic fragments, as I call them, the seeds, the hazard lights, as it were, as I was calling them earlier, these flashes in which I make notes, and then also I read books. Now, what that does is, of course, create a milieu in which I am in constant interphasing conflict with what's going on around me, because I don't have a cell phone, I don't use email if I can help it. I'm still very much a cinema person rather than an online podcast person to some extent, in spite of what we're doing right now. So that figure ground dynamic, that tension between subjectivity, intense subjectivity, and ecology, which is the media ecology, environmental awareness, is the way that I try to work through this shift. I also find, and I counsel many people, I'm a professor at York University, as you know, and what I see with my students is stress, fatigue, depression, anxiety going on. And what I counsel them to do is go offline, rest, read a book. Now, books can be enormously disturbing. I think a lot of mine are, but they are often disturbances. You cannot read McLuhan or Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or T.S. Eliot or Kathy Acker or anyone else without recognizing that the effect of what they're saying is disturbance, dislocation, echolocation, moving you into new spheres. But that figure ground dynamic that I look at, the split between wilderness and wildness that comes about as a result of being intensely aware of our milieu, of the ecology, of the effects of the media, and at the same time setting up subjective resistance, as it were, which is, I'm not advocating this for anyone else. It's just how I work, which is to write by hand, slow it down, meditate, reflect, rest. I see far too many, what do I call it, moralistic Jeremiads saying, this is what everyone should do. I would never suggest such a thing. This is what I do. And that subjectivity meshed with, or mashed, as we might say, with ecology, environmental awareness, as I said earlier, it's my combination of Emily Dickinson and Marshall McLuhan.
What a combo. That was beautiful. And I too am much like you. There's all my printed notes from the beginning of today, and we're studying Dante's Inferno in a
right, wonderful. Which translation? Which translation?
It's a book club based at Sweeney's Pharmacy, the James Joyce pharmacy in Dublin. And it's there's several translations that were utilized, but I agree with you on what you just said, and it resonates with me. The follow-up question is why do humans collect information, and also piggyback that with, is this more innate in humans or more invented?
Well, there's never an either or response to these kinds of questions, because the figure ground dynamic or percept concept relation that we're talking about means both and, being sacred and profane simultaneously, that you are working with good ground and figure and cosmos and quotidian simultaneously. So there is no either or response. We create things. We must. We are making, not matching, is one of my favorite of the McLuhan aphorisms, because, or to put it in a Blakean sense, I start my day, by the way, by reading Blake and Dickinson, and that complementarity, because Blake sees into our time, and of course also Dickinson has that intense withdrawal. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door. But what reveals then, of course, is the imaginative expansiveness, so that subjectivity and ecology element that I'm speaking about. So we invent, we create, we cannot do anything else. That's the poetic genius of the human, that we must invent, we must create, we must remake, make, revise, and that stream of invention. I'd rather use the word stream here than any other. It's a wonderful metaphor. Is combined or alchemically mixed with the response, which is that data begins to take on an appearance of a life of its own. That the inventions have this overwhelming sort of Kafka-esque like presence to us, so that transcendence and immanence, as it were, collide, because we create this. We must transcend our biological limitations by imagining, creating, making. It's a necessity. It's an urgency. It's part of our momentum. It's part of what keeps you going as a creative person, is that internal momentum to invent, to make, to envision. Then the paradox, the flip point, is the complementary other, as it were, is that this towering informational technological manifestation that we concoct, create, invent, project, emanate, then turns around and appears to have a separate existence. And that's where paranoia, anxiety, unease, and projection all begin, which is that seems to be a kind of polarized response in which technology, we invent it. No aliens came down and said, hey, here's a TV. We did this. And yet it seems like it has a separate power and autonomous energy. The prophet for this is Kafka, who understood extremely well in advance that the emanation structures of our inventions will begin to take on an autonomous glow, a radiance, an appearance of the splendor, which is the imaginative, spiritual, suffering need that we have to make things.
Really well put. And Audre Lorde says you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. But Yvonne Rainer responded, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest? And you can apply those quotes or not. It's your choice.
I'm fascinated by the notion, a number of percepts which have guided me, which is one of them is attentiveness, listening. At the end of Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, there's a dazzlingly beautiful passage in which Siddhartha is sitting by the river, and the river becomes a place of voices and images and sounds and faces. And it's taken this long spiritual process of decreating himself in order to become aware of listening. Listening has become, I don't know, enormously overly complicated process for people, and the polarization and magnetism of extremes that we're living in right now, so that the idea of liberalism, for example, which always meant free association, being in the middle, that is in media res, so the medium is the message, means being in the middle. But here we have these extraordinary polarizations, magnifications of things on extremes, so that listening becomes almost impossible. So it's part of the retrieval of the restorative process of sensory delicacy, sensitivity, listening. The other thing is tactility, writing by hand. Try that. This is my leaf of grass. I hold this up and I loll. And one of my exercises with my first year class at York University is to get them to write some of their responses by hand. And what that does, of course, it flabbergasts everybody at first, but they get into it eventually. And what it does is reanimate the tactility, the touch, the fact that we are in touch or out of touch. There's a great virtue to being out of touch, in a sense, which is media-free days, email-free days, allowing your sensibilities to rest. One of the difficulties for us is that we are like Siddhartha in that description I had of the final passage of Hermann Hesse's marvelous novel. And we're by the streams of data in which this wave flux of vibration carries everything. It retrieves everything, enhances everything that we are, could be, will be, and have been. And what we need to do also is, I think, exercise the capacity to meditate on this, rather than immediately, click culture, instead of responding so fast that you have no time for reflection, meditation. Meditate on the stream and practice, and this is me speaking from my angle of things at this point, patient grief, because we are in a great period of sorrow. Death is all around us. We are at a time when excess and violent emotions are spilling out into extremism on the streets. The presence of the contagion, the invisible force, which is spread by touch and breathing. Again, we need to take pause in that. La peste, the contagion that is with us. I don't think of Albert Camus as a particularly prophetic writer. I revere Camus, but La Peste is a prophetic book because he talks about the invisibility of this, how it infects us, infects our psyches, our mind, our politics, our everything. This radical dislocation of through the contagion requires us to know how to grieve, to be patient in our grief, so that when we are meditating by the stream that brings all these expressions of consciousness, of awareness, of sensibility, of breakdown, of crying out, of the murmuring is the message, or the message, as it were, then we need the exercise of patient grief. So the phrase patient grief, by the way, comes from W.H. Auden. And I think that what we're saying about touch, listening, sensibility, meditation time, reflection, rest, stand back, allow the images to speak to you too. Don't just speak back to them. And again, I'm sounding very moralistic and judgmental when I don't want to be sounding like that. And I don't want to be prescriptive. I'm not turning Paulo Coelho on you. What I'm trying to do is say what has come to me, as it were, in this time when we are reflecting, meditating on the currents that are threatening to overwhelm us. That, it's impossible to swim in the current and at the same time as trying to reflect on it. You are only going to be surviving in the current. So that is if you're just swimming in it. So that's why I think this model of this image, as it were, this symbol of contemplation, reflection, and restoring sensory wholeness, fullness. Read poetry, read a poem a day, dream well, start in the morning with that spiritual spark that can come from the words on the page of something by Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman or Emily Bronte or T.S. Eliot, Paul Celan. No matter how much suffering and difficulty there may be in their work, they are restoring the community of breath, But when we read, that is, we breathe in the words. I think the other thing I would add to that too is the haste of our time, the speed, the acceleration, the emphasis and intensity makes us breathless. So to restoring ourselves to breathing in the community of souls, and know that we are all in this, and need to exercise both tactility, attentiveness, listening, and to get away from the awful divisiveness of the either or equation. So many times I will tune into CNN and I'll see an editorial of some kind, or somebody's doing an interview. By the way, digression. I'll put a digression alert if you like. Always check what the books are on the back in the shelves of the people who are doing the interviews. I was mentioning this earlier in another discussion, because it will tell you a lot about what the figure who's speaking, the talking head, as it were. What a wonderful phrase. It sounds so Orphic, doesn't it? You don't know the rest of the body, you just see the head floating in the stream. That the idea that the books will tell you, inform you about what the person's grounding are. So, if an FBI agent has Cormac McCarthy behind him, watch out. But if somebody else has Siddhartha and the Buddha and jazz and all these other things that bring illumination and imagination, maybe they're worth listening to. But that the either or, but back to the CNN editorial thing. Is this right or wrong? Is this good or bad? The more that we think that way, the more that we press ourselves with that way, the more the polarizations continue, because it is good and bad. It is yes and no. It is ground and figure. It is sacred and profane. It is abyss and apex simultaneously. This takes training and perception and slowing down. That's one of the reasons why I continue on in the legacy of some of my teachers, McLuhan and Fry, who advocated the study of poetry, of poetics, in order to slow the process down and recognize this simultaneity, this instantaneousness of the work affecting you, moving you, immersing you, but at the same time, subjectivity and ecology. Be aware of what's around you and cultivate that inwardness.
Really well put, BW. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take a deep breath in.
Yes.
Consciously release it in a meditative way to, rethink a lot. A percentage of my questions are either or, but I'm going to reword them in a way that we'll use them as jumping off points.
Well, why don't a prompt, a suggestion, just a suggestion, what I try to do when I talk to people is just put these out as suggestions, evocations.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to say that I don't do interviews anymore, I do possessions. in part to suggest to people that instead of asking either or, yes and no, both and, start there. What is it that unifies? I don't mean that we're going to all agree. That's a completely different thing. Blake's contraries. Without contraries, there's no progression. But he sees them, conceives them, seizes them as a whole. So it's both and. It is the Lamb poem in the Song of Innocence and Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Songs of Experience. They are the complementary whole. The anxiety, alienation of the constant questioning in Blake's The Tiger. Whether it's who made thee? And then the Lamb, which is the complementary other, should be seen simultaneously with it, which is the Lamb is the same creature, but now perceived as benign, as a sweet creature singing to you. And that you sing the songs back, the Lamb, who made thee, the Lamb itself, who gave you the name, etc. So that is a both and question. Actually, there are 4 levels there, not 2. There's the complementary other of the both and, the alienation and the Song of Innocence. But then there is the person who made them, which is Blake. That's number 3. And then there is ourselves, who are co-creators in the interval between all of these things, remaking, restoring, recreating the possibility of seeing all of them together. That's not easy, but at the same time, the struggle of understanding that the deep conflicts in our time are leading to these either-or principles are leading to extremism on all sides, to the point where, the example that I would make is that I have no idea whether Biden as a president will be progressive, Roosevelt-like New Deal. I think that's what he would like to do. That's his model, even more than Obama. But what he is as a sensibility is a calming influence. And after the disruptions and dislocations and intensities and extremism of the last year or two, and again, step back from Trump and realize how valuable he's been as a kind of towering authoritarian figure that exposes the media processes in their effects. I'm not saying, that I like it. That's an entirely different question. But now you have a moderating, patient, calming influence. And they're like brothers, they're these two figures that are Janus-like, facing one another. And on the mythic level, the two of them are these, one is terrifying and one is calming. And they need each other in a sense. For us, it needs for us to stand back and see that these are aspects of ourselves that have been illuminated vividly in the media age. That's part of what media does. X-rays, it makes things transparent. It makes us see deeply. It's a prosthesis, as it were, to the visionary imagination, and gives us each day the access that an Arthur Rimbaud and a Blake and a Dickinson and an Emily Bronte had in their imaginations, their immediacies, their ever-present, unnameable moment.
Beautiful. And Joe Biden did say that James Joyce was his favorite poet, but let's go on to what I learned.
Didn't he say that it was Seamus Heaney?
I had one documentation that said Joyce was his favorite poet. I could send
Yeats,
you.
He quoted Yeats a great deal, and the Second Coming, of course, eerily prophetic. What rough its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Eerily, uncannily, as it were. In the unnameable present.
Yeah. So McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the intent of the race. He probed this, well about it, that we can look to the artist to uncover the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so we can learn how to cope with them. In Marshall, I've learned that Marshall said that the question is, why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions when we can turn to the artists, the poets, to reveal them to us? How do you answer and process that question?
That goes back to what I was saying before about the counter-environmental project that I experience myself by writing by hand, by listening, by stepping back, by encouraging my students and others that I talk to read. By the way, students have become to some extent the last literary audience. They're being forced to read in some ways, but they are the ones that are carrying on that process. And the word tradition comes from tradire, which means to hand on. And even though tradition is in many ways a bad word, if we think of it as, for some, as a kind of conservationist element, a retrieval from the obsolescence pile, as it were, the rag and foul ragbone shop of the heart, that these are the perceptions that we can carry with you into honing into acute awareness. Yes, McLuhan emphasized literary training as a way to balance out the speed, the instantaneous effects of media, which create whiplash and rebounding, and also that to create, and this is what I emphasize, to emphasize ambiguity, complexity, going beyond the either or, seeing that searching for metaphors that allow us to see the images and symbols of our time. Borges says somewhere, perhaps the history of our time will be a history of symbols, of images, to be able to retrieve these and study them, and at the same time absorb them so that we utter them in ways that allow us to generate more perception. Now, the question you asked is why the media effects dominate us over the literary. Why is it that part of this is the environmental shift from digital to from alphabetic to digital, and so the ground of our own sound electroscape, as it were. People talk about landscape. We are an electroscape, and I grew up electric, as so many did, and so part of my wiring, as it were, is of course the electronic world. It's the hi-fi world. It's the TV world. I was among the first ones generation who grew up shocked, electrified, stunned, as it were, astonished by the new connections and awarenesses that were the awareness that was being generated by listening to Tommy or being, the Who's Tommy, and also to, when you put the needle down on the disc, that you were traveling in the groove towards the center. So that what was the question again?
Why? Thank you. That was beautiful what you're saying. And why do humans ignore the hidden psychic effect, even though we can turn to the poets to reveal them to us?
There are some interesting aspects to that question that I can respond to on a personal, anecdotal way. Tell a story. If all else fails, tell a story. And one of the ways that I perceive this is that if you're in a environment in which you're dealing with where many people are socializing, this is sort of pre-pandemic. Pandemic has done something else to networking, which is that extreme isolation and quarantine has created an even more elaborate, complex charging element of the networking. It's created a new. It's accelerated this birth of this embryonic power that is at work in our lives, and exposed it, which I suppose is one of the benefits of one of the few benefits that I can think of the isolation and networking simultaneity, that paradox. But if you're in a social situation, here's the story, and you see many people around you are using the internet, and they're talking to you at a party, a fiesta, at a gathering, and yet at the same time they have all the paraphernalia of the technologies, the cell phones, all these things going, and to pull them out. Who are we networking with? I'm talking to somebody in Australia or New Zealand or North America or Spain, where I spend a good deal of time. And so the environment becomes one of this sort of sensory closure in which we are inside this bubble. And the story that I'm telling you is one in which you could tell people, by the way, all your data, the information, the influence, the sensory effect, the rewiring of your consciousness and sensibility is occurring this way. You have the telephone, the people using this, and then telephone and computers, and then they're on computers at the same time as we are. And and then they're shocked, they're startled, they look at you like you've gone mad. It's like the penguin in the March of the Penguins that might actually say, why are we going this way? Why isn't there an evolutionary jump drive in which someone says prophetically to the other penguins, don't you think there's a better way than this? Why are we going? I know that lovely movie is often championed as an example of, family love and feeling, the protectiveness of the elders for the children. And it has that aspect. But the question that kept coming to my mind as I was watching this is, where is the wild thing that's saying, the Blake, that's stepping out and saying, why are we going in this direction? Where is the evolutionary hot jump drive? Well, the experience that we're having right now is the evolutionary jump drive. It is the knocking on the door. It is the ripping off the doors of the hinges, as Whitman would have said. And it is the moment in which, when we're gathered in a room and we saw everyone hibernating, as it were, or networking or expanding their senses and consciousness while their body stays here, that is the moment when we need to awaken to be able to see that there is this vast influencing patterning at work, that through the technological invention that we have externalized. But the one of the things that I find so fascinating is how people will be in denial about that. They will actively resist. What are you talking about? Why is this like this? And I said, I'm not the only one saying this, others have said it. But the fact that this overpowering global membrane structure, or if you wish to call it that, this hyper element of intensity, which is now enveloping everyone, and whether I like it or not, it's here. That process of pulse, of momentum, of interconnection, of networking is stretching human identity and consciousness into forms of twisting, as it were, into new forms that allow us to see at the same time as be immersed. This is why the story I'm telling, or trying to tell in the midst of all these digressions, is to say that here is, look at the situation where or the context, or the ecology, and better word, in which our subjectivity is being uploaded and downloaded and spread everywhere simultaneously. And we are curious. Says you can't go in. Who never says you can't walk through. But for some reason, it's so forbidding, it's so terrifying that we don't go through the arch. And the pilgrim from the country ends up withering like the hunger artist into a kind of dust until at the end of the parable, which of course parables don't end, they unveil and extend in our imaginations, said this door was always open. And that is what the doors of perception have always been open. They always have been. So why do we deliberately close them? I think it has something to do also with trauma, with addiction, soft addiction. It also has to do with lack of awareness of the ground and how the ground is radically. For instance, right now, across my screen, it says your internet connection is unstable. That is one of the warnings from the cosmos. But it is also a pronouncement, an enunciation of the creativity, the energy, the vitality, the discontinuity that's involved in what's going on. The instability is a moment where we can, here, this is here. This is the stream in front of us. This is the illumination, revelation, awakening, and initiation, all at the same time in the stream of perception, awareness, consciousness, and sensibility that is striding in the blast, on the blast, as Shakespeare says.
BW, I'm having many aha moments, and I'm glad that we're here together and you're expressing yourself so well and articulately. Appreciate it. Please tell me your earliest memory, or one of them.
Several that would association come to mind. I would like to write a memoir of the senses, of the awakening of the senses from childhood to teenage years. And so you've really put an interesting point there, question. The earliest one would be traveling with my mother on the train to Alberta to visit my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. And that being moved from a steady environment, as it were, to one that was mobile, moving. And so that while I was fascinated by what was outside the window, that the landscape was changing, altering, the transformation through that technology of that invention, that machine of the train. The second one that I would have too, that I have is actually described in one of my novels, where a character is experiencing it, is when we moved from Ottawa to Toronto. I was very young, 2 or 3. And I remember very vividly, as people did, television became a babysitter. But television did not begin until 12 o'clock at that time. That really dates me. And puts it back at the time when I would sit in front of the screen and there would come on that Twilight Zone moment where the little dot at the center of the TV would explode into an image. And it would go from the deep space, as it were, of the Big Bang, and then expand and expand and expand, vibrate, wobble, and then Twilight Zone-like become the image. And of course, it was stark black and white. And that conditioning of black and white still makes me very sensitive to black and white. And even though there are people that I know will not watch anything that is in black and white, it was part of the sensibility conditioning, as it were. The other thing was listening to my mother play the piano. That would be the third memory. She was an amateur pianist, greatly gifted, and liked to play Chopin and Schumann, particularly the Kinderszenen, early in the morning. Curiosity for me, was that she never liked any of us to watch her. We had to be in the other room. So I still have a deep sensitivity to voices coming from another room, sounds coming from another room, songs, somebody singing in another room from another place, crossing the abyss, as it were, of the wall, through the walls, through the barriers. And then last but not least, there are 4 memories. You asked for one, but you asked the question. So here it goes, which is that when I was little, and my mother would take me to the park, I very much liked the swings. And my little daughter, I have a 3-year-old daughter, has carried that on. She loves swings. She likes to just go higher and higher and higher. But when I was about 2 or 3, my mother would always take a book with her to the park and read while I had learned to swing by pumping my legs. Well, one time I was pumping and pumping and pumping on the swing, and I went higher and higher and higher. And I suddenly said, I went to myself, I remember it very vividly, wonder what this feels like to let go. And off I went, sailing into the air and crashed down onto the ground. And of course, hurt myself. And my mother streaked over and said, "What were you thinking of? You let go." So there are 4 very powerful, vivid memories. Also, if you want a 5th one, I can do it with my father one night watching television. And the first thing that I would always be trundled off to bed. I would be 5 or so, 4 or 5 at this point. But that night, in the black and white TV set in the living room, there was a performance of Shakespeare's The Tempest on TV. Now, this is years later, I realized this was one of the legendary ones with Richard Burton and Maurice Evans and Roddy McDowall as Ariel. Richard Burton played Caliban. And I was utterly transfixed, fascinated. And when my parents put me to bed, I crawled out of bed, went back into the living room, and went behind the couch because there was a little interval between where they were sitting and the wall, and watched on the side, fascinated by the Isle of Art and Prospero's magic and Miranda's vision of this brave new world, and at the same time, the Caliban's magical insight into the isle is full of noises, sounds, and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that if then I waked after long sleep will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds, methought, would open and show riches to rip, would drop upon me, and I cried to dream again. So that moment, in part, cultivated the love for Shakespeare, planted that seed. But at the same time, then The Tempest remains my favorite Shakespeare play, and partly because of this great poetry of the Isle of Art, in which everything, Ariel, Caliban, all these spirits are whirling around it, very much like our environment or the global experience in which these energies are flowing and coming around us. So what you're asking really when you ask that question is, you are now the tree or the flower. What does it mean to go back to the seed?
Well put. I love it. Thank you so much. BW, tell me someone within your immediate family who made an impact on you, was a role model, and what specifically was that main trait you got from them? Briefly. And then the second part is outside your immediate family. So you get what I'm searching for.
The primary influences, and I know that shaped me. This would be part of the memoir that I would like to write, going back to the seed from the tree or the flower, would of course be my mother, the musician, the one who sang to us, who loved to talk to me about Glenn Gould, and we would argue at a very early age because I was introduced to music and performance through her. And her marvelous, indelible influence of the creative life that was thwarted in her to a great extent. She was part of that Depression World War II generation where she did not have the free associative power to, or didn't think she could do those things. And then, of course, my father, who was a politician, worked for Lester Pearson, Saint Laurent, Lester Pearson, and John Turner, Canadian prime ministers. And so there was a kind of initiation into political consciousness and great liberal traditions which existed at that time and are in danger of being shattered or destroyed or stretched by the magnetism. You know, when I speak about liberalism, everyone thinks you're thinking about neoliberalism, which is really another word for conservative economics. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the great tradition of the enlightened middle, as it were. And that's part of the legacy of my father, who was also a writer, and we always talked about books. Also, my uncles, who were Holocaust survivors. They were part of the Kindertransport. Both of them were saved by a man named Schindler, who I think is, sorry, not Schindler, Nicky Winton, that he was like Schindler. He foresaw what was going to come. So this legacy of suffering, of affliction that came from members of the family who lost all their family in the Holocaust, and gratefully grew up in North America. And in our small circle of family, brought that process and presence and aching memory of suffering and pain and loss, so that we were raised with a powerful, my sister and I, with a powerful sense of the solidarity of the communion with suffering, that people had lost much. My father was also a soldier at a very early age. He ran away from home at 17 to join the army and was sent home, and then had to, when they found out how old he was, and then he went back at 18 and ended up in Europe. My uncles were kind and generous people who had a surface of cynicism about the world, but underneath it were devoted and loving, and told us. And I would never have understood what the Holocaust and what European Jews went through if it had not been for the legacy of their witnessing and of their companionship with us. And if I may tell a quick story there, if you don't mind, I love stories. My uncle Joe lived in Paris for many years as a journalist, reporter for the CBC News. And he'd like to phone me up when I was a teenager and say, if you can pay your own way over, you can come and live in Paris with us for a while. So of course I found my way to do so. And once when I was quite young, he said, when I was there with him, he said, would you like to go and meet Jean-Paul Sartre? And Sartre, for me at that time, at 16, 17, he was the idea of the writer, the engaged writer, the witness, the one who wrote in almost every genre except for poetry, in every form. The figure that could be spectacularly wrong, but it didn't matter because he was engaged with his time and place, and could be spectacularly illuminating in his fiction and dramas. And so I said, yes, let's go. So off we went to the cafe where he was, where there was a famous cafe where he and Simone de Beauvoir would sit and have their morning coffee and brandy and croissant and write. And there was Sartre across the street, across the boulevard, with his patch over his eye, writing away in a blue notebook with a brandy and a coffee and a croissant. What a great way to start the morning. And my uncle said, would you like to go and meet him? And I froze. I couldn't move. I was too much in awe. Here was one of the great figures of the time. I don't know where Simone de Beauvoir was, but that was the other question. Where is she? And so I didn't go. And my uncle, who was bold and a courageous soul who survived all the experiences to become a globe-trotting journalist, pushed me to go and meet Sartre. And I couldn't do it. So we went off together, and my uncle had a brandy and coffee and croissant, and I had a cup of tea. And years later, the conclusion to the story is this. Years later, I went back to Paris, actually not so long ago, on my own, and went to see that place, that cafe. And there was the chair with a little plaque on it saying, Sartre wrote here. So I went over, sat in the chair, ordered myself a tea and a croissant, because I don't drink. I didn't bring the brandy. I didn't order the brandy. And I began to write. I came home and went to visit my uncle, who was dying at the time. And I sat with him and I told him that story, that I had sat in Sartre's chair and wrote for the day. My uncle reached across the bed, touched my hand and said, BW, there's been some progress.
Hallelujah. That is
and of course, the mentoring, the other question you asked was the mentoring. My sister has been a great influence in my life too. She's a wonderful, sweet soul, and has, as a painter, and lived a very intense and interesting life. And our conversations, which in the early years were often quite conflicted, as we were competing for the interests of our parents, of course. But she's always been a companion and a friend. And of course, my children, all of them have been fantastic influences and have allowed me to enter the garden of innocence over and over again through their visions, which of course they lose as time goes on and experience begins to ironize them, unfortunately. But they are still there with that wonderful visionary streak that all of them have. And right now I have the great luxury of having privilege of having a very young daughter who likes to, 3 years old, who likes to teach me all the time about how we live in the forest, the forest of figures and myths and cartoons, and how Maleficent and the good prince and the good witches and the bad witches are all there simultaneously in our mind, something that we lose as time goes on. And then mentoring guides, of course, as time went on, there were many, but McLuhan, of course, excuse me, and Fry and Pierre Trudeau. And
Really well.
Excuse me, Emily Dickinson, who mentored me through the medium of the book.
Yeah. Did your parents raise you a particular religion, and are you still practicing, or is there a time when you checked out?
No, there's a complicated question. My mother and father were agnostic Anglicans who paid some homage to the ceremonies of the church in order to instruct us in its mythologies and morality. They were not particularly credulous believers. My father was, in fact, deeply skeptical, but perhaps too skeptical to be an atheist in the end. And my mother and father introduced us to this, but I perplexed them from an early age. I think my sister also was much more skeptical, and still is to this day. But I was enthralled by the rituals and the ceremony and the presence of the supernatural and the communion, which haunted me right from the start. And my mother told me that I would have these great dialogues with the priest who was conducting the Sunday classes with us about, where were we when we fell? what is the nature of the supernatural and the natural? How does the cosmos and the quantum cosmos, as it were, and the quotidian mesh and collide? So there was a spiritual radiance, as it were, that I felt at a very early age. In my teenage years, I did everything to resist it and put on a mask of the angry young man to try and push it away. But people who knew me well knew that it was not, it was a mask that was, in a sense, pushing away things that were pressing, that were showering me, as it were, or raining down around me, and things that I found at the time a little too overwhelming to absorb. Sometimes the beauty of a sentence by a writer I admire, like Virginia Woolf or Rachel Carson or Thomas Mann or Kafka, would allow me to re-enter that radiance, that sense that somehow there was something beyond the period, beyond the exclamation mark, beyond the question, beyond the comma, in the gaps, in the spaces. This is one of the reasons I revered Emily Dickinson and then eventually Paul Celan and other writers, because of the space that was there, that they point to. The space in Celan is terrifying, but in Dickinson, it's rich ambiguity in which it can point both ways, both back to the words and point forwards to illumination or a possible association with what is the supernature around us. And I don't mean that I mean supra nature, the kind of illuminating power. And later years, it became a question of conversion too, which I've written about a little bit. And I've talked about how paths and trails and the caminos in my life have led sometimes towards becoming more devoted to certain religious practices. But I have to say that I'm a very bad practitioner that is fallen. And I know that the tension I often feel between the quotidian and the sacred is one that has become more and more personalized over the years. That is, it's more how I help to step back from the overwhelming impacts of the technological spheres, and it's part of what provides, soothes, and inspires and seeds the momentum of continuing to create. Do I pray every day? Yeah, I do. And I have two stories about that. I love the one about Voltaire being caught praying at one point, and his mistress asked, "Monsieur Voltaire, you're an atheist. Why are you praying?" And his response was, "I'm practicing to be turned down." And then the other story I like very much too is the idea that prayer is a form of meditation. It's a way of piercing through the clouds. It's a way of echoing and calling and trying to invoke the response to. And it's the sense that through our misunderstandings, our breakages, our breakdowns, our alienation, that something is around us speaking to us. What it's saying right now in the midst of pandemic, contagion, breakdown, technological extremism, threats to democracy is, I cannot answer. And I don't understand. Some of my own breakthrough processes has been a question of despair. And despair is an authentic, I think, spiritual response, and a necessary one at times to understanding that, or misunderstanding that the vehemence of and the mystery of this vast birth project process that is occurring around us, this streaming of identities and data, requires us to acknowledge we're in the wilderness all the time.
BW, that was great. The Voltaire was really fun, and it reminded me of W.C. Fields was looking. He was looking in the Bible, and they go, "Why are you reading the Bible?" He goes, "I'm looking for loopholes."
Yes, one of my favorite stories too.
So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin about 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Years later, Faulkner said the best fiction can be more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Well, now that's at the conclusion of the movie Soul, the Disney movie that's just been premiered, which is that the jazz musician learns to just breathe at the end, which is to just accept that life is beautiful in itself. And I don't know whether I would call it an artwork, because that diminishes the presence, the sense that all things have their sensual pleasures, but also their vitality. Art, I think, can help to re-see, and reimagine, and reignite, and restore, and reconfigure our senses so that we have that intimate connection with the things. But unlike Joyce, I know, thought that Finnegan's Wake was his all-night newsreel, was his film. And the way the book is incomplete, that it goes in this, it doesn't end with a full stop. It ends in this recycling process in which you re-enter and re-enter and re-enter, so that more and more illumination. Hell is being trapped in a circle without knowing where the circle is going. Recycling, or paradise, is a vision of enhancing and consciousness growing and growing, like the white Empyrean rose at the end of Dante's Divine Comedy, in which love creates the enlargement and perceptions, and which the communion of souls and the dance of the souls grows and grows and grows and grows, so that the vortex is that way, upward rather than downward towards freeze frame, limitation, single vision, negativity, which all narrows that perception. So the murmur is the message. Things have changed. Art is also there. Poetry, poetics, cinema, expression is there to preserve the crying out. My friend Diane Keating, the great Canadian poet, calls it, or the murmur is the message. That the idea that we're howling, crying, murmuring, vibrating, speaking, inarticulate at times, stammering, that we need that, because it's not just to see the tree, it's to hear our voices.
Yeah. So well put.
Blake says a wise man sees not the same, that a fool sees not the same tree that a wise man sees.
Yeah.
We can update Blake to say a fool sees not the same PC that a wise man sees.
Updating. That's so. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'm going to set this one up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, "If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them." Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK says, "Forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name." Fellini says, I need an enemy. Chinese proverb is, he who cannot agree with their enemy is controlled by them. So the basic question, BW, is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you specifically react to the Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I'm not familiar with that remark of Watts, though I'm familiar with his work. I think that there's a great wisdom in that, in part, in that the apparition, the appearance, the media adept force, say, of someone like Trump, who was a media adept. He understood it very, very well on an intuitive level, not obviously not on a rational level. But so to ban him, as it were, from media is a wise though complicated thing. It raises all kinds of interesting questions. But notice how the tension levels, the muting of that voice, things begin to slow down, diminish somewhat. Though, of course, as you know, it drives that voice underground and makes it even more turbulent and powerful there, because when you drive something underground through prohibition, it will break out in some other form. I look at it this way, part to respond to this very interesting question. You do need an enemy in order to have the friction, in order to have the controversy, the debate, in order to be able to redefine. Without contraries, there's no progress. Misquoting that by Blake. Without contraries is no progression from the marriage of heaven and hell. Bring the figures in so that you absorb them, and at the same time understand their suffering too, and their conflicts inside them, and be able to use that energy in order to create, individuate, redefine, reshape, and continue on this process of exploration, which truly is endless. We are aeronauts of the spirit always. That is to say, you don't reach final conclusions of anything. The conclusions are to be wary. You should be wary of conclusions, because that means you may have stymied or stalled the soul's spirit, that spirited momentum towards finding something that is not a closing point, but a beginning point. But I would respond to in a kind of multiple way, which is to say that the Catholic in me forgives what happens. The Buddhist in me thanks the enemy for the process. Thank you for the gift. The Sufi in me says this was all Allah's will, and we are part of that process of the great mysteria, the mysterium of our experiences, which we cannot comprehend entirely. And the Jewish side of my family upbringing would say yes to the above, but never forget what the hell happened. And finally, the nihilist side of us, which is in all of us one way or the other. Nihilism is a condition now. It's not a theory. That it would be, well, I don't know what happened anyway. So humility of recognizing that misunderstanding someone who might appear like an enemy, and realize that in fact they may be the great friend. I think it is unwise for us to reject the stranger, the foreigner, the exile, the person who is bringing new experience to you, because they may be someone who is speaking to you in a way that you needed at that moment. In the First Nations traditions, and we live in Stouffville, a small town outside of Toronto, in which the Ojibwe nations are close by, and then there are reserves quite close. And I have friends among them, especially a great spirit teacher for me, a woman named Raven. And she always says that the spirit creatures, sometimes negative spirit creatures, will appear to you when you need to be taught a lesson. Or to put a nice gloss on that, remember the joke, the person who's being led out to be shot in the morning, and he says, well, this is going to teach me a good lesson.
And I love James Joyce teaching me, remember to forget. So Moshe Feldenkrais says that it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Please tell me a weakness that you've incorporated to become a strength.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Talk about the e-cosmos being a vast synchronicity. I'm a practitioner of the Feldenkrais methods, and I have a mentor, a teacher. I've had several, and one named Fialka Voss and the other one named Frederica Benthal, and they have instructed me and massaged and worked with me and trained me in this sort of yogic-like practice of allowing the body to heal itself. And when I'm away from it, of course, we can't really do it now with the quarantine, I can feel in my body sometimes that the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities and the availabilities can create a desire to protect yourself, that you shrink. There's Kafka again. We become like mice because we shrink down, hoping the blows will go past us, or the blows will not be so severe that they knock us flat. Disappearing into smallness is a way that hoping the storms will go over you, go past you, or that the enemy, who is that projected figure of oppression or tyranny that comes upon you, will ignore you, will pass by. So yes, actually, these days, though, I try to encourage in myself the practice of vulnerability. To allow that opening, whether it's a wound, whether it's suffering, whether it's chronic pain, which I have, whether it's receptivity to what others say, the vibrational elements around you. This is arduous, difficult, draining, and at times impossible. But that's part of the quest too, and part of what I learned from as a teenager when I tried to insulate myself in the mask of the angry young man was that the either-or principle in my mind at that time. And I began with my first book, A Climate Charge, talking about McLuhan and Fry as being an either-or in the Canadian sublime artistic expression. World sublime now too, because they're very much world figures. But that was wrong-headed and an error, and I acknowledge the error but it was also an error that was a portal of discovery towards the both and sacred and profane simultaneity. And also to cultivate the vulnerability, the availability, the receptivity, the capacity to misunderstand. And I still allow that jazzing to come to you, that improvisational element, so that the breakdown in you is to break concept and keep moving towards perception, which must come from susceptibility, suggestibility, vulnerability, receptivity. I'm the first to say that is an arduous task, but Cormac McCarthy, revered figure in my pantheon of writers, says that in All the Pretty Horses that his heart will be with the ardent, with ardency, with passion. And I share that it is why I would take Simone Weil over Karl Barth, for example, because it is the passion, the ardency, the recognition of mistake, error, breakage, but at the same time, the practice of vulnerability. That's Siddhartha sitting by the waves, listening to things. Now, Siddhartha is an enlightened figure. Simone Weil is an enlightened figure. I'm not. I'm still exploring, still trying to find my way through that darkness that is upon so much of us, the data darkness. And all I can do is share the sparks that have come to me.
Wow, BW, that was so beautiful. And I've seen you read your poems out loud. The basic question is, what is the function of poetry? But just let me set it up with a few thoughts. A screenwriting teacher told me that great art or great poem, great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great film, great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. So Leo Barsani's Mallarmé study basically says this: the very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition. So maybe you could talk about those points and basically what's the function of poetry?
I have a poem somewhere about that question. It's in my files. It is the question of what is poetry now. I don't know the answer to that because it is whatever we make. The word poiesis means to make. And so, Pound's famous definition, the antenna of the race, when we are all now antennae of the race, that is the condition of the global environment, of the global communication environment, of the pulse or cell or membrane, whatever you call it. We are all antennae. We are all creator, have that creator spiritus, as the veni creator spiritus, the Latin phrase, which is we are summoning, initiating, and being part of revelation and shock all at the same time. So witnessing must be a big part of that, but that sounds a bit glib. What I would prefer to say is that we are voyagers in the flow fire of our unnameable present, and in that moment, in that communion of souls, we try to find the words and the metaphors through the very vulnerability that we have. And I don't see the books being separate. Now, this is an area of some controversy because I know some people will read the literary criticism and the philosophical work and the stories and the novels and the latest one, the Charge on the Global Membrane, and the poetry as being, I do not think in those categories. They're all one work. They're all obsessive about the same thing, which is growing up electric. They're all about, as well, about that vulnerability and the fact that, when I read Blake, let me respond it this way. Blake is fully formed as a poet when he's 16 or 17. It's sort of Rimbaud-like. They're right from the beginning. He has technical control, virtuosity. He also has something to say. His sensibility is acute. His receptivity, his mythological imagination is already beginning to unfold. Anything I wrote at 16 or 17 is appallingly bad. And not so long ago, I put a lot of material in the New York University archives from when I was a teenager. And when I read it over after throwing a lot of it out so that it wouldn't be preserved in the archives, I thought, did I have the nerve to think that I could possibly be a writer with this crap that I'm seeing, this material that was formidably bad? So in so many ways, I've this metamorphic element of practicing vulnerability and understanding the grief in me and around me, and that alchemic combination of inwardness, subjectivity, and environmental awareness has grown, I hope, and has metamorphosed in my life and has unfolded more and more and more, so that I feel now, somewhat later in life, that the genius of creativity, which is separate from the person, that daemon, is more with me now than it was at that time. So yeah. I would hesitate to define because I love the undefined. I would hesitate to fully clarify and articulate because I like the hidden, the invisible, the metamorphic, the surprising, the astonishment. I would hesitate to say that I could define something when I love the undefinable, the unformed, the beginning, and the embryonic. I had to learn to cultivate that in myself when I loved it when I was very young. Look at that story I told you about listening to The Tempest, or watching The Tempest with my father, or listening to my mother play the piano, or listening to my uncles tell me about the great suffering that they had experienced in Europe. That it was there, but I insulated myself and tried to make myself a mask of either or and satiric outsider elements. Talk about the enemy in reading Wyndham Lewis and how he defined himself as the enemy, but in the end it ended up being a kind of poison for himself and a detachment that ended into total estrangement from the suffering of the world. And that process that learned to the practice of vulnerability and listening and being and my personal resistance to the overwhelming power of electronic media by writing by hand, by spending time with music. I still play music and my guitar, and that allowing that touch to move into the storms that are around us that are undefinable, but at the same time to preserve that inwardness. That's where the poetic energy is for me. I cannot say that would be right for anyone else. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that I no longer like to teach creative writing. I've had some wonderful students. Joseph Boyden, who's a great Canadian novelist, was one of my students. And bless his heart, he likes to acknowledge the time that we spent together. But I learned from him. He didn't learn much from me. And one of the reasons that I don't teach it is because not only to inject that hesitation about what happens when you go out into the creative world and want to make a career out of it, which is a separate question, isn't it? But to allow the vocation of vulnerability to continue in the work so that I keep striving through the blast to find the words that will articulate, express in that moment the fire flow of the vibrations that I feel all around me.
BW, if you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Good luck.
BW, can you forget to die?
No. Death is part of our existence, and if we don't absorb death, as St. Francis says, if it's not a friend, if we take it as an enemy, we will be tragically crushed. And death is so much in the air and part of our time. I cannot read anything right now. This is very much located in the moment, that is not inhabited or possessed by an awareness of wreckage, of breakdown, of death, of mortality, of loss, and of suffering. I listen to some of my beautiful colleagues sometimes talking, particularly in the McLuhan line, as if we are not in the midst of this. They're responding beautifully to the technological phenomena, but that subjective personal awareness that suffering is in us, that it's part of what we identify. And if that isn't inhabiting or possessing the words of those that I'm reading, I can't read them right now. That may change, of course. But at the moment, I would have to say to friends and colleagues and others that I need to see the vulnerability. I need to see the nerve ends exposed. I need to see the availability. I need to know that you are mourning and grief too for the suffering around us, and frequently the needless suffering, like the storming of the Capitol in January 6th, in which pain was inflicted on us through the trauma of images. That this is part of the poetics of our time, and the poetics of our time must be a poetics of vulnerability and suffering too. We are at the bedsides of everyone who is in pain. And the more available you are in the unnameable presence to that ineffable effect, which is that the invisible airwaves are carrying all of us all at once. All of us are all at once, and all at once is all of us.
BW, your words touch me deeply, and they make me think, and I really am inspired. I really appreciate how articulate you are, but also how poetic you are in saying the words. Your form and content comes over me, washes over me like a warm bath. And so Joseph Boyes says that make the secrets productive. Lou Welsh, let me finish the little intro. Lou Welsh, the great beat poet and ad man. How about this for beat poetry? Lou Welsh wrote, "Raid kills bugs dead." How's that for beat poet? But he said, in regards to secrets, guard the secrets, constantly reveal them. But it was in 28 that Thornton Wilder said, art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time. So generally what I ask now is, thank you so much for laying your cards on the table for the last 80 minutes. I'm very grateful. And I'm not insinuating you haven't said this. What's it really all about for you?
That there may be some small virtue in being obsolete.
If it works, it's obsolete.
I would also add, I revere Joseph Boyes, and I see him as an artist who put his experiences and as a warrior in World War II on the wrong side, on the line, and his great art in the moment experience of being trapped inside an exhibit with a wolf seems to me to be one of the most courageous, daring, vulnerable, and available and receptive moments in all of art. It's a signal moment. I'm also, as a result of learning over the years, I have learned something. I can be taught. One of the reasons that I love to teach is because, as difficult as teaching can be sometimes in the climate these days, is so that I can learn, so that I can be in a room in which they feed me. Sometimes, again, provocative things that upset and disturb my focus and attention, but they're necessary complementary other of having innocence and experience collude, as it were, or alchemically combined. But one of the things that I have learned too over the years, again, slow learner, that's part of, I'm lucky I had more years to work, I hope, that the alchemist maxim, beware of the princes, not princess, beware of the princes, beware of the rulers, beware of those in authority and power who may use what you do and say and take the secrets of the alchemical process, the phoenix-like possibility of being able to rise again and rise again and rise again through the fire flux of the moment. Power to pass on to others who may misuse it or abuse it. And this is something I have to reflect back on, because I was raised in politics. The other side of my background, and my father was that he was part of the liberal machine in Canada. And if you know anything about Canada, the liberals believe they built the country. Sir John A. Macdonald was a liberal. He was a conservative, but actually it was a mistake of the party affiliation. He was actually part of the liberal process. And you have the legacy of Trudeau #2 after Trudeau 1, and I know them both, and I knew Trudeau Sr. very well. And part of that companionship was because of perhaps a bit of hero worship on my part, which I've had to criticize of myself and challenge as I see over the years that what power has become in the last decade or so, particularly with the acceleration and magnification of polarized stances, and this sort of demonic element that has been exposed through media access. So there is a self-questioning, a self-criticism going on in how many times I think I have maybe transferred some perceptions to energies that perhaps I should not have been speaking to, addressing directly. No book so bad that it cannot serve as a good example. And it seems to me that there are times when you have to accept that was true in the moment. That was the fire flux stream that you inhabited, immersed yourself in the moment. But that in the long run, it is not what taught you the most. It taught you other lessons than what you thought you were doing, engaging in. So there's a secretive element to the famous epigraph to Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man from Ovid's Metamorphosis, in which Joyce cobbles together as epigraph saying, and now is mine On the other hand, one of the great undertakings that we all have is to engage that mystery in whatever expression it may have. And one of the scripts I have was a handwritten book. Wouldn't that be an interesting challenge, I hope, to the conscious of our time, which sees everything in terms of right. So it's an art that doesn't inhabit. Are you still there, or did I lose you?
Yes, BW, there was some freezing, and we know in the McLuhan world, the gap is where the action is. So we'll just all have to fill in what was there. I'm going to ask you 5 quick questions. Just use a brevity in 3 to 5 words. Ask them, answer them, please. It's Alan Watts's, and then we're going to bring Clinton in. So just briefly, who started it all in 3 to 5 words?
The source.
Are we going to make it?
Good luck.
Where do we put it?
In your back pocket, close to your heart, too.
Beautiful. Who's cleaning it up?
We all are. That's part of our vocation.
Is it serious?
Never.
What a delight. I'm going to turn the time over to Clinton, and then I'm going to return to close us out. Thank you so much, sir. This has been an amazing, enlightening time.
Thank you, too, for your great questions and your enthusiasm, keenness, and your inspirations, and also from the warmth that was coming from your end, too. Much, much appreciated on a cold, wintry, snowy, blasting day here.
Thank you.
Need to, as the fellow Canadian, Clinton, we need to export Canada to Texas to teach them how to deal with this.
I'm already on it.
And also to tell those fools who are in charge down there that government intervention doesn't mean you have to bleed things red. That's an in joke.
There are so many threads I could pull on. This has just been absolutely delightful. Although one phrase which has sort of been bouncing around since you said it is the trauma of images, because it seems to be precisely, it gets to the crux of one of the most severe effects of living in the global memory and electric, growing up electric, as you put it. And it's precisely that resilience seems hard to come by, and simultaneously resilience and skepticism when it comes to images can so quickly turn into a callous, and it comes off as callous. So for instance, it seems like one of the largest impediments to communication is precisely deciding what is a legitimate traumatic mass experience, in the sense that we're so young as a species, as even encountering mass experiences where
we're keeping in mind how young we are. Yes, I appreciate that. Yes. We are so self-centered that we think that the cosmos, as they say, revolve around. How many people does it take to change a light bulb? As they say, just one, but he thinks the rest of the world goes around him. That's very much the unfortunate side of the humanist legacy, which is that we are the center of the cosmos, forgetting animals, forgetting trees, forgetting flowers, forgetting clouds, forgetting light, forgetting food, and all the things that are around us and grow. So I like what you're saying very much, and also because we're in this accelerando, this hyperdrive of Genesis overdrive, as I call it. There is, this act. Think that we are, we are evolving very, very quickly, but that's part of the trauma too, which is the evolution is simultaneously beyond our grasp, and the thing that we've created, that we've created the accelerando. The trauma of experience. We made another very interesting point too that I admire, which is the danger of being calloused, of being hardened, and I, as I said earlier, a bit of self-critique. When I was a young man, I put around me the mask of hardness, of satire. I put around me the mask of the outsider, the sort of masking the sensitivity and vulnerability that I had, and suffering from melancholia, which I have all my life. That callous surface had to crack and break down and allow the other to break through. But trauma, constant trauma, shock, That's another word in the electronic world, the electric world, we must keep in mind. The trauma of images leads to shock, and the shock can break down our resistances and reactions and make and our opinions. But it can also, as you said, suggested wisely, that it can create an even harder surface. The only thing that's truly hard and unmoving is a corpse. That's something to keep in mind. That flexibility, vulnerability, meditation, reflection, to stand back from the trauma is hard. I do not want to imply in anything that I've said that this process is anything other than arduous.
Well,
At the same time, look at what the alternative is: harder, crueler, more miserable, more dangerous in afflicting others with the pain and suffering that you are withholding in yourself, and rather than act in a gestures of empathy and compassion as much as one can, given our limitations. None of us are saints. That's another calling entirely. Poetic calling is one thing. Sainthood is an entirely other one, of which, of course, few of us will ever make it to. Being human seems to me to be a signal accomplishment in itself.
That's saying something in the post-human age.
I get what you're at. The inundation of images, and correct me if I'm wrong, you would be more an insider on this one, that one of the dreams, reveries that Osama bin Laden reportedly had was that he foresaw the falling of the Twin Towers. He saw them in a dream. And his comment was, again, this may be apocryphal, but it's certainly interesting even if it's untrue, that he knew that if you injected the crashing of those towers into the medial loop, it would drive everyone mad. Now, again, I don't know if that story is true. I'd like it to be, because it certainly explains a lot. But at the same time, even if it's not true, it carries the seed of something illuminating, which is that the medial loop can create madness, lunacy, obsession, addiction, breakdown, turmoil, turbulence, and extremism, because our attempt to understand, which is our perpetual attempt, wants to freeze frame something into a theoretical structure, a protocol. I've got it. And that can be a hardening of a position. I teach in a university where theory sometimes becomes a kind of hardening towards the new, that is concept over percept. That's not a bad thing at all if you allow it to flow over you and allow it to permeate you and be a part of your process. When it becomes an orthodoxy that excludes, or a hardening that harms the sensibility, your sensibility, or the better word is receptivity, suggestibility, sensitivity, then yes, one must watch. And the trauma of images in our time is one of the illnesses or afflictions that we are not addressing enough. I know that Baudrillard and others did so in part, but it's just a beginning process, because it has psychological, neurological, and sensory implications. It's not just a theory or an idea. It is what it does. It affects us. And perhaps the inability to grieve at times is a sign of the hardening or the evasion that's going on, in which we omit from our psychic experiences the deep pain that this inflicts on us. So, you know, the word I just used the word is actually a short form for understanding media. It's the initials.
Effects preceding causes, no doubt. Or inspirations. That's fantastic.
By the way, one of the books I'm working on, and I'm still looking for a publisher, if you're out there, is a book on the codes of inspiration.
The codes.
And it's what I was working on in Cordoba in Spain during my sabbatical leave there. And my wife is Spanish and from Andalusia. And my great vast family that I inherited from a very small one in North America to a very large one in Spain is they're living around Cordoba or around Cadiz and some of the other great Spanish cities. It's the cauldron, as it were, where Picasso and Lorca and Hernandez, and so many of the great poets. And these days, Antonio Machado, one of my favorites, because I can understand enough of his Spanish in order to translate him poorly, but at least it's absorbing. When you translate, you are absorbing it into yourself and your own bloodstream and psychic processes, and then restoring the poetic through your language by looking at it and reinventing it, as it were. That was one of the books that I was working on and had to sideline for a time because we went into quarantine. I lost my access to the great library at the core of Cordoba, and it's one of the great walking cities. It was the capital of the Moorish Empire, by the way, and the Jewish, Catholic, Gypsy, and Moor traditions, the Sufi, Catholic, so-called pagan, Gypsy, and Kabbalic streams all converged in this city. I didn't know that when I met my wife. I'm from Cordoba. I knew it through the Borges story, but nothing else. But this is one of the great gifts in my life from her, among so many, love and other things.
You stumbled into the navel of faith somehow.
Yes, but I had to put the book aside because there was this vast historical epidemic that came upon us, and the contagion, La Peste, as I mentioned earlier, is suddenly infiltrated that, and the city closed down. The city was stopped, and it was suddenly no one in the streets. There was a great silence, and in fact, Cordoba, because it's very old, was used sometimes as an example in the media in Europe of what it looks like in an ancient city in which there's no one there. And so I had to step back and from that book, but it is one I would like to return to, maybe in another discussion someday with Clinton or my great friends now, all of you, is what are the codes of inspiration? And this comes from years of the interesting alchemy of a Canadian in Spain and Andalusia.
Well, thank you so much, Clinton. That was a great finalized question. I got a couple more, BW.
Well,
and
I just wanted to quickly mention, I'm a great fan of the Marx Brothers movies, and there's a wonderful line in what I think it's in Duck Soup. I may be wrong. Someone can correct me on this. In which Groucho has a discussion with someone, and then he asks some questions, and he asks some questions, and then Groucho asks him some questions, and finally says, it's very dangerous to ask a question. You never know what might come out.
It's very dangerous, and it's so great that you have this cloned ESP or real ESP, because my final question is rooted from the question that Groucho Marx was asked at the end of his life. But just to retract for a second, words evoke more in their meaning. And I love this that you said, which is understanding media.
See,
and
in the conversation, we say but it's actually a moment of perception too.
It's amazing what you just taught me there. And I like to hear all the variations on medium is a massage, medium is the mess age, medium is the mass age. But I thought I came up with one that's rather original. Medium is the me sage, meaning me is a sage, and sage is the herb for the throat, which is talking through the vocal cords. So I think you've been a sage to us all, and I do hope this will continue forever, and we'll continue these dialogues. This second to last question is, what's the healthiest cultural shift you see developing today?
Well, let me answer that with twofold. The first one is one of my favorite Marx Brothers movement movies is Horse Feathers, which is where they take over the university and inject anarchy into the university. And at one point, if I'm misreading or misinterpreting or misunderstanding the moment, that's part of our process too. Groucho is talking to a group of people in a classroom, and his son runs in, played by Zeppo, and says, "Dad, this is not your classroom." And Groucho responds, "I know, but my class won't listen to me." And so, and what was the second question again?
It is, that's Auden said, professors are people who talk to people who talk to people who are sleeping, who are in their sleep.
Well, sometimes it's true. I mean, I find that being in a classroom with people especially in the Zoom room network speeding, accelerated, magnified state, has actually created an interesting exchange of fire. That is their soul fire. I sense their alienation, and that alienation is profoundly important for learning. The more alienated you are, the more possibility for breakdown and breaking down the presumptions and preconceptions and conceptualizations you have. So alienation is extremely useful in that way. To overcome it is not the right word. Overcoming anxiety so that you absorb it is the better phrase. But the being in a classroom also and being paid for it, I have to be honest about it. That's my children have the habit of 3 meals a day. God knows I've tried to break them down to 1, but it just simply didn't work. And so being paid to survive is a good thing. And since none of my books have ever made much money, as they said, when you meet somebody and they said, I read your book, and you say you were the one. That's the experience most of us have. But on the other hand, to share my ignorance and that questing is part of why I continue to write as well, so that eventually you do hope that something will spark something. The humanization of the process of electronic exchange through teaching has been a complicated one, and my fallback position, in case you didn't notice, is monologue. So one of the things that I find myself sometimes missing in the electronic exchange in the humanities classrooms of the Zoom room is the spark of dialogue exchange and seeing the other, meeting the other in the crossroads of the room, and being able to respond to their figurations, their body language, as it were, and to be able to move. You and I, all three of us, have now been sitting for a long time. And this is not necessarily the best way to learn. The best way to learn is to move and to be moved. And so, yes, there is that too. And then putting it on your eyes so that you put the fire back into yourself. Still, in the turning world, in the whirlwind, in the wilderness wildness that we are inhabiting and being possessed by simultaneously, that the learning process is changing too, so that there is this online access. And I have a wonderful former student named Elliot Shepard, who has, at his own bequest, created a YouTube channel based on our conversations and work and poetry and songs and music and connections. And this is because I have to concede and understand and accept and submit to the processes that are changing all of us. All at once, or all of us are all at once. And while my preference is to write by pen, pencil, write at home, solitude time, write books, write by hand, as I showed you, the preference should not be allowed to use the phrase you used earlier, to harden into a position that's so fixed that you can't move, you can't learn, you can't be refreshed or fired again into this great flux stream that's all around us. The danger, of course, of the flux stream is that it overpowers us. The vibration patterns that are at work here afflict us, take us over, and the extremes of paranoia that are at work right now are perfectly intelligible in a way. I mean, I see all these editorials everywhere about saying, where's this coming from? Well, our instinct is paranoid, which is to create patterns that paranoid means paranous. It means to be outside the mind. It doesn't have a pejorative in its original Greek implication. It's become pejorative. But as Northrop Frye once said in class to us when he was talking about Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, that remarkable novel, that the paranoid structure or projection, as it were, is creative, intensely creative. It's inspired by the fact that you want to make an intelligible order out of things, because the difference between a book and reality, as someone said, is the book makes sense. So you are trying to create a pattern recognition, as it were. And the danger, of course, now is that because paranoia is available to everyone on the net, or part of what we do on the net, that vast, essential, imaginative act of creating meaning, even if it's dire, even if it's apocalyptic, even if it's Armageddon-like, even if it's conspiratorial, is part of our creative streaming. It's part of the fire. So we need instructions and practice and being able to stand back and say, that is a wonderful artifact or a devastating inferno that you've now created for yourself, like QAnon. But step back and watch what it is that's happening when you, like Siddhartha, back to that, sits by the stream meditating on them, so that the afflicting side, the menacing, destructive side moves elsewhere. But, you know, the paranoid conspiracy phenomenon reminds us that we're not alone.
Yeah. And we hope to do sessions with Elliot. I'm glad you brought him up. And for the final question at this session, and we are not alone. We've been so lucky to have you with us, BW and Clinton, and all the people who will watch this and have experienced it live. BW, what gives you the most optimism? This is the question they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life, and I'll tell you his answer at the end.
Well, what? Oh, I don't know how Groucho may have responded to that, but I'm very attracted to what Oscar Wilde said on his deathbed. He had two comments. And needless to say, with Oscar Wilde, he couldn't shut him up. You know, he was even in dire despair in exile in Paris. He took a look around at the wallpaper in the impoverished room where he was living at the end, and he said, "One or the other of us has got to go." And his other great line, of course, at the end was, "I shall die as I have lived, beyond my means." The optimist says this is the best of all possible worlds. The pessimist is afraid the optimist is right. So it seems to me that the better gesture, or the stronger gesture, is hope and light and co-suffering, and allowing the fire stream of the poetics to continue. That's not very pithy, but I'm not finished yet. So you come back to me when I'm.
We will come.
I will just be very happy, delighted, rejoice in having you as companions in the fire stream towards the end.
Yeah. Well, we will come back to you, BW and Clinton. Thank you so much. And I'll tell you, when they asked Groucho at the end of his life, what gives you the most optimism? He said, other people. So it's sure been nice sharing this time with other people. Both you, BW and Clinton, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Bruce, for continuing to dare to frame fearful symmetries.
Yeah.
Thank you. What a nice thing to say. Thank you. Blessings on both, and inspirations to you always. And may your path be tangled.